The braid was half finished when Owen Wells finally understood that he was in love with Charlotte Keller, and the realization hit him with more force than any bullet ever had. He sat behind the little girl on the porch steps, his scarred, gun-calloused hands moving through her dark hair with a gentleness that seemed to belong to a different man entirely, and Charlotte stood in the doorway watching him with an expression he could not read and could not stop thinking about. She had not said a word. Neither had he. The whole world had contracted down to the sound of the wind moving through the cottonwood trees, the distant lowing of cattle on the ridge, and the soft breathing of 6-year-old Marigold Keller, who sat perfectly still and trustful between Owen's knees, as though she had always known he would not hurt her. Charlotte's hands were pressed flat against the doorframe. Her knuckles were white. She had been awake since before dawn, dealing with a crisis that threatened to swallow everything she had built in this brutal, beautiful territory, and she had come out onto the porch expecting to find her daughter alone and distressed, because Marigold had woken crying and tangled, and there had been no comb and no ribbon, and Charlotte had been pulled away to deal with the man from the bank before she could fix it. And instead she found this. Owen Wells, the most feared gunslinger in 3 counties, a man with a dark past that half the town whispered about and the other half was too afraid to discuss, sitting with her daughter's hair between his fingers, working out the knots with slow, patient care, as though he had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. The betrayal she had been planning to accuse him of died in her throat before she could speak it. Because here is what Charlotte had discovered an hour ago, crumpled in the lining of a saddle bag she had no business opening. A letter, written in Owen's hand, addressed to a man named Silas Croft. And Silas Croft was the man who had been trying to take her land. She had been certain, in that moment of cold, devastating clarity, that Owen Wells had been planted here as a trap. That his arrival in Dustcreek 3 months ago, his quiet presence, his offers to help, his slow and careful way of looking at her like she mattered, had all been the hidden motive of a man working toward a secret end. She had been certain her heart had been the instrument of her own destruction. But then she came out onto the porch and saw those hands in her daughter's hair, and she could not make the two things fit together inside her chest. She did not know yet what the letter actually said. She had not read past the greeting before the bank man arrived, and she shoved it into her apron pocket with shaking hands, and now it sat against her hip like a coal she had swallowed whole. Marigold said, "Mr. Owen, is it done?" Owen said, "Almost, Miss Marigold. Hold still just another moment." And Charlotte pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and tried to remember how to breathe. This is where the story truly begins, though it had been building for 93 days before this morning arrived to crack everything open. 93 days since Owen Wells rode into Dustcreek, New Mexico territory, on a gray September morning in 1882, with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, a single Colt revolver, and a reputation that preceded him by at least 200 miles in every direction. Dustcreek was not a glamorous town. It sat at the edge of a wide, sandy basin where the Rio Picos turned sluggish in the summer heat, and its main street was composed of a general store, a saloon called the Broken Spur, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a telegraph office, and a sheriff's office that had been without a proper sheriff for 4 months. The town's last lawman had ridden out after a confrontation with a land syndicate, calling itself the Croft Land and Cattle Company, and nobody in Dustcreek had been surprised, because the Croft Company had been making trouble in this part of the territory for 2 years, and its methods were not gentle. Charlotte Keller had arrived in Dustcreek 14 months before Owen did, coming west from St. Louis with Marigold on her hip, and a deed to 160 acres that her late husband Daniel Keller had purchased through a land grant before he died of fever on the wagon road. She was 28 years old, which was considered somewhat old for a widow trying to homestead alone, and she had no family west of the Mississippi and no money beyond what she could earn. She had a stubborn streak, however, that the women of Dustcreek recognized immediately as the specific kind of stubbornness required for survival in this territory. And they had taken her in with the quiet solidarity of women who understood what it cost to stay when everything logical said to leave. Charlotte had made the land work. She had planted a kitchen garden. She had taken in laundry and sewing from the men at the adjacent ranches. She had negotiated with a neighboring rancher named Hector Vega to run 20 head of his cattle on her land in exchange for a share of the yield, and the arrangement had been modestly profitable and had given the Keller property enough visible activity to look like a functioning ranch rather than an abandoned claim. And then Silas Croft had decided he wanted her 160 acres. The reasons were not mysterious. Charlotte's land sat directly between the Croft Company's northern holdings and the best water access on the Pecos for 30 miles. Whoever held the Keller property controlled the water. Silas Croft understood this with perfect clarity, and he had begun the process of acquisition with the same methodical persistence he brought to everything, starting with polite offers, moving through increasingly less polite pressure, and arriving by the time of Owen's appearance in Dustcreek at a campaign of hidden motive and outright intimidation that included fences cut, cattle scattered, and a loan called in by the bank in Roswell that Charlotte had taken out to repair her roof after a spring storm. It was the loan that was the most immediate threat on the morning Owen rode in. Charlotte had 40 days to repay it or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings, and she had nowhere near enough money. She was coming out of the general store with Marigold on her hip and a pound of cornmeal she could barely afford when she saw him ride in. She noticed him the way anyone noticed a man like Owen Wells, with an involuntary attention that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with self-preservation. He was tall in the saddle, lean in the way that came from hard living rather than deliberate deprivation, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something angular and still. He wore a duster the color of old dust and a hat that had seen better decades, and the single gun at his hip was worn low and easy in a way that told anyone paying attention exactly what he was. He looked at Dustcreek with eyes that Charlotte later described to herself as measuring, as though he were calculating something only he could see. He looked at Charlotte for exactly 3 seconds, and then he looked away. She told herself it meant nothing. She had enough trouble already. She was wrong about the meaning, but she was right that it would become trouble. Owen Wells had not come to Dustcreek by accident. He had come because of a letter, too, though not the one Charlotte would later find in his saddle bag. He had come because he had spent the last 4 years trying to walk away from the life of his dark past, a life that had made him infamous and had cost him things he did not talk about and could not recover. And a man he had once saved in Abilene had written him from Dustcreek saying that there was a town that needed someone to keep it from being swallowed whole by a syndicate with deep pockets and no conscience. The man's name was Reverend Thomas Aldred, who ran the church schoolhouse, and he had met Owen 2 years prior when Owen stopped a robbery that would have killed half a wagon train, including Aldred's wife. Owen had ridden toward Dustcreek the way he rode toward most things in his life now, not with enthusiasm, but with the quiet resignation of a man who knew he was better at only one particular set of skills, and had decided to try to use those skills for something other than pure destruction. He had not expected Charlotte Keller. He had not expected the way she squared her shoulders when she saw him, like a woman who had already been disappointed by everything the world had to offer and was simply bracing for one more thing. He had not expected her dark eyes or the child on her hip, or the way she moved back into the store without looking at him again, deliberate and self-contained and completely unimpressed, and he had not expected the way that particular combination of qualities would settle into his chest and refuse to leave. He took a room at the Broken Spur and spent his first week in Dustcreek doing very little that was visible. He drank coffee, not whiskey. He sat on the saloon's porch and watched the street. He talked to Reverend Aldred in the evenings and to the other townspeople with a patience and quietness that confused those who knew his reputation, because the man they had heard about was supposed to be dangerous and cold, and this man was simply very still and very observant in a way that felt different from menace, even if it was not entirely comfortable. He learned the town's geography quickly. He learned where the Croft men rode on their rounds. He learned that the bank manager in Dustcreek, a thin, nervous man named Gerald Pierce, was receiving incentive payments from Croft's operation to make things difficult for specific landowners. He learned that Charlotte Keller's loan had been called in under dubious circumstances and that she was running out of time. He did not approach her directly for 11 days. The 11th day, he came to her farm because her fence line on the western boundary had been cut again, and he had seen the Croft riders do it from the ridge where he had been sitting with his horse in the shade, and he thought someone ought to tell her. He repaired the fence himself first, which took 2 hours, and then he rode to the farmhouse and knocked. Charlotte answered with flour on her hands and a look on her face that said she had been expecting a threat and was recalibrating for a lesser but still suspicious category of visitor. "Your west fence was cut," Owen said. "I repaired it." She looked at him for a moment. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," Owen agreed. "You didn't." She stared at him another moment. "Who are you?" "Owen Wells." He watched her process the name and saw the flicker of recognition, followed by the deliberate choice not to react to it. "I'm staying at the Broken Spur. I saw the Croft riders cut your fence from the ridge. Thought you ought to know." "I already knew they'd been doing it," Charlotte said. "I fix it myself." "I know," Owen said. "I'll let you get back to your work." He turned his horse and rode away, and Charlotte stood in her doorway watching him go with the specific confounded expression of a person who had been prepared for a fight and instead received assistance they did not ask for and cannot find a reasonable complaint about. He came back 3 days later with a coil of new fence wire he had ordered from the general store, because hers was old and would not hold another season. He left it on her porch without knocking and rode away before she came to the door. She found a note tied to it that said, in plain, unornamental handwriting, "For your fence line. I also spoke to Gerald Pierce at the bank about your loan. There may be another arrangement possible. I'll explain if you want to hear it. O. Wells." Charlotte read the note 3 times. Then she went inside, put it on the table, and told herself very firmly that she did not trust this man and was not going to begin now. She was already beginning. She just did not know it yet. The next Sunday, Reverend Aldred preached a sermon about the particular courage required to accept help gracefully, and Charlotte sat in the third pew with Marigold asleep against her shoulder, and felt as though the sermon had been delivered at her personally, which it may well have been. Owen sat in the last pew. He did not look at her once during the service. He sang the hymns in a low, unpracticed voice that suggested he was a man who had once known the words and was finding his way back to them cautiously. Marigold had woken up during the last hymn and turned around on the pew to look at him with the uninhibited directness of a 6-year-old. Owen had looked back at her with an expression Charlotte caught from the corner of her eye, not performative, not condescending, just a simple, honest acknowledgement of another human being. He had given the child a small nod. Marigold had nodded back with enormous seriousness and turned around again. Something in Charlotte's chest had moved. After the service, standing in the churchyard with the other women while the men talked by the horses, Charlotte had finally allowed herself the full shape of the question she had been avoiding. What was Owen Wells actually doing here? Mrs. Hector Vega, a broad-shouldered woman named Rosaria, who was Charlotte's closest friend in Dustcreek, said without prompting, "I asked my husband about that man. Hector says he came from Reverend Aldred's letter. Says he was a hired gun for some years, but that he has been trying to put that behind him since his brother died." Charlotte said, "His brother? Killed in a dispute over grazing rights in Texas 3 years ago. Story goes that Owen was the one who was supposed to be there, but he was 2 days' ride away and couldn't get back in time. His brother tried to handle it alone. Rosaria shrugged, but her eyes were careful. A man carrying that kind of guilt is either very dangerous or very determined to do better, sometimes both. Charlotte thought about that for a long time on the ride home. She went to see Gerald Pierce at the bank the next morning. Pierce was uncomfortable in the way of small men caught in larger schemes, fidgeting with his collar and avoiding her eyes. But what he told her was significant. Owen Wells had come to see him 4 days ago and had made it very clear, in the polite but utterly unambiguous manner of a man whose reputation backed every word, that calling in Charlotte Keller's loan under the current terms and circumstances was something Pierce should reconsider very carefully. Pierce had received a letter from the Croft Company's lawyer that same afternoon. He was currently caught between two pressures of very different natures, and his instinct for self-preservation was pointing him sharply away from Silas Croft's direction. "I can extend the loan another 60 days, Pierce told Charlotte. "And I can look into the original terms, which I will tell you privately may have been applied incorrectly." Charlotte walked out of the bank into the high white noon light of a November day and stood on the wooden sidewalk and felt something dangerous happening inside her. The dangerous thing was hope. She had learned to be careful with hope. It had let her down before in ways that had cost her deeply, and she could not afford to be let down again. She went to find Owen Wells. He was at the smithy, she was told, having his horse reshod. She found him there in the warm, iron-smelling dark of the forge, talking to the blacksmith, a patient, amiable man named Elijah Moore, who was one of the few black men in Dustcreek, and who had come to the territory from Georgia after the war looking for the specific freedom that open land and one's own labor could provide. Owen saw Charlotte come in and straighten from where he had been leaning against the wall. She said, "Pierce is going to extend my loan." "Good," Owen said. "Did you threaten him?" Owen considered this. "No, I simply made the situation's implications clear to him in a way he found compelling." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "You did this without asking me." "Yes. I'm capable of handling my own affairs." "I know you are," Owen said. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no apology, but also no arrogance. Just a plain statement of fact followed by something that was almost an explanation. "The Croft Company sent 3 men to your fence line in the dark, Mrs. Keller. That's not a contest that plays out fairly on individual effort alone. I wasn't trying to suggest you needed saving. I was trying to change the odds." The blacksmith Elijah made himself very busy with something on the far side of the forge. Charlotte said, "Why?" Owen said, "Because what they're doing is wrong, and because someone ought to do something about it." It was such a plain, unadorned answer that she did not know what to do with it. She had been expecting something with a hidden motive. She had been expecting him to want something in return. But his face held nothing she could name as calculation, and she had become very good at reading calculation in men's faces over the past year and a half of defending her claim. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Wells. I'll find a way to repay the assistance." He said, "There's nothing to repay." She left the smithy with her jaw set and her composure intact, and a trembling in her hands she did not allow herself to examine until she was well clear of the building. December came. The territory turned cold and sharp, and Charlotte's farm held its own through the first big freeze. Owen remained in Dustcreek. He did not push himself on Charlotte, but he made himself consistently, unobtrusively present in ways that she found increasingly difficult to dismiss. He fixed the hinge on the church door when it broke during a windstorm. He sat with old Pete Garza, who was sick with pneumonia, through 2 nights so Pete's wife could sleep. He talked Silas Croft's outriders out of the saloon twice when they came in looking to cause trouble, and both times he did it with words alone, standing with a stillness that was more effective than any drawn weapon. The town was starting to watch him the way towns watch a man who is becoming necessary. There is a particular quality to that watching, equal parts relief and wariness, because a man who becomes necessary also becomes someone you can lose. Charlotte was watching him too, but differently. She was watching him the way a woman watches something she is trying very hard not to want. It was Marigold who breached the wall first, as children often do. Marigold had taken to appearing at Owen's table in the Broken Spur dining room on Tuesday mornings, when Charlotte came to town for supplies and errands. She would sit across from him with enormous solemnity and inform him of various important facts about her life, that her cat was named Biscuit, that her favorite color was the particular shade of blue the sky turned just before a storm, that she had learned 3 new words that week and would like to know what Owen's favorite word was. Owen's favorite word, he told her after serious consideration, was steadfast. Marigold repeated it slowly. Steadfast. It means you hold on, Owen said. Even when it's hard. Marigold had thought about this for a long moment and then said, with a child's piercing directness, My mama holds on even when it's hard. Owen said, I know she does. Charlotte, who had been listening from just outside the dining room doorway with a hand pressed over her heart, turned around and went back to the general store and told herself very firmly that she was not crying. She simply had dust in her eyes from the road. The forced choice came for Charlotte in January. Silas Croft himself arrived in Dustcreek on the 14th day of the month. He was not what Charlotte had imagined. She had imagined someone large and overtly menacing. Instead, Silas Croft was a slim, well-dressed man in his early 50s with a polished manner and careful eyes. The kind of man who had learned that the most effective form of threat was the kind that sounded like reason. He came to her farm directly and was entirely pleasant about it, sitting at her kitchen table and drinking her coffee and explaining, with the air of a man doing her a favor, that he was prepared to offer her significantly more than market value for her land, more than enough to buy a house in Santa Fe or Albuquerque and start over somewhere easier. You're a widow alone, Mrs. Keller, he said, not unkindly. This land is going to keep taking from you. I'm offering you a way out. Charlotte poured her own coffee, sat down across from him and said, I'm not looking for a way out, Mr. Croft. I'm looking for you to stop cutting my fences and interfering with my loan. His pleasant manner did not waver. I don't know what you're referring to, he said, but I will say that the territory is changing. The small homesteader is going to find it increasingly difficult in the years ahead. Water rights are going to be contested more fiercely. I'm simply offering you a choice, while the choice is still a good one. He left his offer in writing on her table and drove away in a very fine buggy, and Charlotte sat alone in her kitchen for a long time after, staring at the numbers on the paper. They were good numbers. She was not going to pretend otherwise. They were better than she had made in the last year put together, and if she took them, she could buy Marigold a warm bed in a proper house in a proper city, and give them both a life that did not require fighting for survival every single season. She was still sitting there when Owen knocked on her door at dusk. She had not told him Croft was coming. She had not told anyone. He had seen the buggy from the road, he said, and recognized it, and he had waited until Croft left and then waited another 2 hours to give her space before he came. She told him about the offer without deciding in advance that she would. Owen listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, What do you want to do? Not what she should do, not what was smart or safe. What did she want? She looked at him across the table and said, I want to keep my land. My husband bought it with money he didn't have and he died before he could stand on it, and Marigold was born in this territory and this is her home. I want to keep it. Owen nodded. He said, Then we keep it. We. It was such a small word. It cost him nothing to say it. It cost her an enormous amount to believe it. She let herself believe it anyway. In the weeks that followed, Owen began working with her in earnest, not as a hired hand but as a partner, though neither of them used that word. He knew things about land disputes and legal challenges in territorial courts that surprised her, and it turned out that his years as a man for hire had required him to understand enough law to navigate around it, which meant he could also use it. He helped her compile documentation of the fence cutting, the bank interference, the pattern of harassment from Croft's men. Reverend Aldred knew a lawyer in Santa Fe named Marcus Webb who had been looking for exactly this kind of case against the Croft syndicate, because Croft had pushed out 3 other homesteaders before Charlotte, and the pattern of behavior was a lever that a smart legal challenge could use. Charlotte wrote letters. Owen rode to Roswell twice with documentation. The case was slow and uncertain, and the threat from Croft's men remained constant, and through all of it Owen was there at the edge of things, reliable in the way of something built to last. February. The territory was cold, and the days were short, and Charlotte began leaving coffee on the porch railing when she knew Owen was coming by, which was most mornings now. She told herself it was practical hospitality. She told herself it meant nothing about the feeling that moved through her when his horse appeared on the road, a warmth she had not felt since before Daniel died and had not expected to feel again. She was 30 years old, and she had already loved one man and lost him, and the loss had been a dark passage. She was not sure she had entirely come through. She was not eager to make herself that vulnerable again. But Owen was not asking her to be vulnerable. He was just there. He was just steadfast, to use his own word, and the steady, reliable weight of his presence was doing something to her defenses that deliberate courtship probably could not have done. One evening in late February she asked him about his dark past, not the rumor version. She said, "Tell me what it was actually like. The years you worked as a hired gun. I'd rather know the truth from you than keep piecing it together from what other people say." He was quiet for a long moment. They were sitting on her porch in the cold evening air, with the sky going violet over the ridge, Marigold asleep inside. He told her honestly. He had been 22 when he started, young and angry after his father's death, left the family's Texas ranch at the mercy of creditors who had done it legally but not fairly. He had a natural talent with a revolver and a head for the kind of thinking that violence required, and he had sold both for 15 years to ranchers, land companies, and individuals who needed problems solved. He had not killed innocent people, he said, but the men he had faced had not all been guilty either, just men on the wrong side of a contract, and he was not comfortable with some of what he had done. His younger brother James had worshipped him, had wanted to follow him into the same life, and Owen had said no, had worked to build James a legitimate start on a small ranch, had refused to let him become what Owen was. James had died anyway, protecting that ranch from a land dispute that Owen had been too far away to help with, killed by men probably not very different from Owen himself. He said, "I came to Dustcreek because Reverend Aldred asked me to, and because I was looking for a reason to be something other than what I was. But I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Keller. The skills I have are the skills of a man who has done things I'm not proud of. I can't unmake that." Charlotte was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I'm not asking you to unmake it. I'm asking you to tell me who you actually are now." He turned to look at her in the fading light. She said, "The man I see now is not the man in those stories. That's all I can speak to." They sat in silence for another few minutes, and the silence felt different than it had before, more open, less defended. When he stood to go, his hand brushed hers on the porch railing, and neither of them moved away from it for a moment longer than was strictly accidental. She thought about that for a week. March came, and the case in Santa Fe was making progress, and Silas Croft responded by escalating, which Marcus Webb the lawyer said was predictable and actually helpful to their case, because it showed a pattern of retaliation. 2 of Croft's riders came to Charlotte's property directly on a Wednesday and told her she had a week to accept the offer, or they could not promise the property would remain intact. Owen appeared from the barn where he had been repairing a hinge and stood between Charlotte and the riders without a word or a drawn weapon, just that stillness that communicated its own message perfectly clearly, and the riders left after exchanging a look that contained their entire recalculation of the situation. Charlotte said afterward, her voice level but her hands shaking slightly, "You didn't draw on them." Owen said, "Didn't need to," she said. "You could have been killed." Owen looked at her. He said, "So could you, if they'd decided to come back while I wasn't here. That's why I've been here." She walked back into the house before she said something she was not ready to say. That night she took the forbidden thought out and looked at it clearly for the first time. She wanted him to stay. Not because of the land dispute. Not because of Croft. She wanted Owen Wells to stay because the farm was quieter and the world was colder and smaller on the days when he did not come down the road, and she had started planning things around his presence in the careful, hidden way of someone who knows they are becoming dependent and is frightened of it. She thought about Daniel, who had been a good man and a gentle husband, and who had died in the 3rd month of the journey west with a fever that moved too fast for anyone to outrun. She had loved him the steady, domestic way of two people building something together, and his loss had been the kind of grief that hollows. She did not know if she was capable of the other kind of love, the kind that is larger and more dangerous, or whether she even wanted to be. She was still thinking about it in April, which is when Marigold's hair became significant. April in the territory was unpredictable, warm one day and biting cold the next, and one morning Charlotte rose before dawn to find that her cow, the single milk cow she depended on, had gotten through a gap in the pasture fence and needed finding before she wandered into the scrub and was lost. Charlotte took her horse and went after her without waking Marigold, who was sleeping, and when she finally found the cow and herded her back 2 hours later, she arrived home to find Marigold awake and tearful on the porch steps, hair tangled beyond what a 6-year-old's fingers could manage, and Owen's horse tied at the fence post. Owen had ridden up to find the child alone and distressed and had been sitting with her, talking quietly, when he noticed the hair. Charlotte came up the path and stopped. Owen looked up at her, then back at Marigold. He said to the child, in a tone that was so matter-of-fact it could not possibly be dismissed as anything sentimental, "Want me to braid it?" Marigold said, "You know how to braid," Owen said. "My sister had hair down to her waist. I learned out of self-defense." Marigold considered this and then turned her back to him on the step, the universal gesture of a child granting permission. And Owen Wells, the most feared gunslinger in 3 counties, whose hands had done things that could not be undone, put those hands into a 6-year-old girl's dark hair and began to work out the tangles and then to braid, with the careful, patient attention of someone who understood that the thing in his hands required gentleness. Charlotte stood in the path and did not move. She thought about the letter in his saddle bag. She thought about the name Silas Croft. She thought about betrayal and hidden motives and the dark past of a man she had been trying not to love. She thought about his hands in her daughter's hair. She could not make those things occupy the same universe. Marigold said, "Mr. Owen, is it done?" Owen said, "Almost, Miss Marigold. Hold still just another moment." And Charlotte pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She had to know about the letter. She made herself go inside, made herself take it from her apron pocket, made herself unfold it and read the whole thing. It took her less than 3 minutes. The letter was not what she had assumed. It was not a report to Silas Croft. It was not a betrayal. It was a letter to a man named Silas Croft, yes, but it was written in the tone of ultimatum, not alliance, and what it said was this: that Owen Wells was aware of the Croft Company's operations in the Dustcreek area, that he had compiled sufficient documentation to bring a case in territorial court, and that he was extending a single opportunity to Croft to withdraw his claims against the Keller property and the 3 other homesteads under pressure, before that documentation was filed. It was a warning, a contained, professional, utterly unambiguous warning. And at the bottom, in a line that made Charlotte's throat constrict, "I am personally invested in the outcome of this situation, and I will not be moved from it." She folded the letter. Her hands were not shaking anymore. She went back to the porch. Owen had finished the braid and tied it with a strip of leather from his vest pocket, and Marigold was running her fingers along it with the satisfied expression of a child who has been taken care of. Owen was sitting back on the step, watching her with that quiet expression he wore when he thought no one was looking, which was the expression Charlotte had come to think of as the real one, the one without any performance in it. Charlotte said, "Marigold, go inside and have your breakfast, please." Marigold went and Owen stood, and Charlotte said, "I found the letter." He went very still. She said, "I thought you were Croft's man. I thought the whole thing had been a trap." Something moved across his face, not guilt but pain. Charlotte, it was the first time he had used her name, just her name without the Mrs. or the formality, and she felt it in her chest. She said, "I read all of it. I understand what it was." She stopped. She had to stop because she had been running on the adrenaline of fear and discovery for 3 hours, and it was running out, and what was underneath, it was something much more frightening. "You were willing to go directly to Croft, alone, with a letter that would make him furious, without telling me." Owen said, "I was going to tell you. I wanted it to be further along first. I didn't want to raise your hopes until—" "Stop," Charlotte said, not angry, desperate. Why are you doing all of this? You could be in Santa Fe, you could be in Texas, you could be anywhere in this territory working for someone who pays. Why are you here doing this?" He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming in low and yellow across the porch, and Marigold's braid was visible on the step where the girl had just been sitting, and the cottonwood trees were starting to leaf out in the warm air, and everything was very still. Owen said, "Because I am in love with you. And I have been trying to handle it the right way, and I'm not entirely sure I know what the right way is. So I've been trying to do useful things instead, and I'm aware that's not the same as actually telling you, which is what I should have done a long time ago." Charlotte stared at him. He said, "I'm not asking you to feel anything back. I understand if you don't. You asked me why, and I can't lie to you." She looked at him for a very long time. She thought about Daniel and about the hollow grief and about the 14 months of holding on alone and about the stubborn refusal to need anyone because needing people was how you got destroyed. She thought about a man who braided her daughter's hair and wrote letters to dangerous enemies on her behalf and sat with sick neighbors through the night and sang hymns he had half forgotten in the last pew of a small church in a high-desert town. She walked across the porch and she kissed him. It was not a polished or rehearsed kiss. It was the kiss of someone who has been holding something back for months and has run out of reasons to keep holding. His hands came up and held her face with the same gentle care he had used on Marigold's hair, and he kissed her back the same way, careful and certain. And when they broke apart, she kept her forehead against his for a moment and said, "I am very frightened of this." He said, "So am I," she said. "Good. Then we're the same kind of frightened." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, not really, and it was a good sound, rough and genuine and not at all practiced, and she thought she would like to hear it frequently. Marigold appeared in the doorway with a biscuit in her hand and looked at them with the expression of a child filing something away for future consideration. She said, "Are you going to stay for breakfast, Mr. Owen?" Owen looked at Charlotte. Charlotte said, "He's staying for breakfast." Marigold went back inside. What followed the porch was not simple. There is a particular kind of foolishness in thinking that the acknowledgement of love resolves anything, because what it actually does is raise the stakes to a level that was previously deniable. Charlotte now had something new to lose, which was the worst and best thing that had happened to her since Marigold was born, and she held it with the specific tenderness of a woman who knows the value of things and knows how easily they can be taken. The legal case moved forward. Marcus Webb filed the documentation in territorial court in early May. The Croft Company responded with its own lawyers, and the thing moved into the complicated, grinding machinery of territorial law, which in 1882 was not entirely reliable, but was better than it had been, and was getting better still. The case was built on the pattern of harassment, the documented interference with the loan, and testimony from Charlotte and several other affected homesteaders, including a Mexican family named Reyes who had been driven off their claim the previous year, and whose experience was particularly damning evidence of Croft's methods. Owen testified. He was a complicated witness because of his past, and Croft's lawyers tried to use it against him. But Marcus Webb had anticipated this, and the way Owen sat in that courtroom and answered every question with direct, unembroidered honesty, including the questions about his years as a hired gun, was its own kind of testimony about a man's character. He did not excuse himself or perform remorse. He simply said what he had done and what he had not done and what he was doing now, and there was something in his plainness that was more convincing than any crafted narrative would have been. Silas Croft was not a man who accepted limits gracefully. He sent a man to warn Owen directly in late May, a man named Dutch Carver who was known in the territory as someone who carried threats that were not hypothetical. Dutch Carver came to the Broken Spur and told Owen that Croft was prepared to make his life very uncomfortable. Owen listened to the whole speech. Then he said, "Tell him I've been uncomfortable before. Tell him the case is filed and the documentation is in 3 places, and that even if something happened to me, it proceeds. And tell him that if any of his men come near the Keller property, I will consider my personal investment in this situation fully activated." Dutch Carver left. He did not come back. Charlotte found out about this later from Elijah Moore at the smithy and went to Owen with a contained fury that was actually fear wearing anger's clothes. She said, "You can't keep doing things like that without telling me." Owen said, "I know, I'm sorry, I'm still learning." She said, "I need you to still be here. Do you understand that? I need you to stay alive and be here. That means you tell me when threats come." He said, "All right," she said, "say it like you mean it." He said, looking at her steadily, "Charlotte, I will tell you I mean it." She let out a breath. She said, "Good, now come have supper." She had started cooking for him regularly in late April, an arrangement that had developed so naturally it was hard to say exactly when it became something she did without thinking. He was at the farm most evenings. He was helping with the cattle arrangement she had with Hector Vega, which was expanding now that her claim was more stable. He was good with cattle and better with horses, and he could repair almost anything that broke, which on a working farm was a constant and valuable ability. Marigold had decided she loved him. This was not a quiet or subtle declaration. She had told Reverend Aldred, Mrs. Rosaria Vega, the blacksmith Elijah Moore, and at least 2 other townspeople that Mr. Owen was going to be her papa, and that she had decided this herself and considered it settled. Charlotte had heard this at second and third hand and had spoken to Marigold about not making declarations on other people's behalf, and Marigold had looked at her with the specific patience of a 6-year-old who knows something the adults are still sorting out and is prepared to wait. Owen had heard about Marigold's declarations too. He had not said anything to Charlotte about them. He had simply, one evening in early June, when Marigold had fallen asleep by the fireplace with her head on his knee, looked across at Charlotte and said, very quietly, "I want to do this right. I'm not a man with much to offer in the formal sense. I don't have property. My reputation is a complicated inheritance, but I want you to know that I am asking, seriously, and with the full weight of what I mean by it, if you'll have me." Charlotte put down the sewing she had been doing. She said, "You built my fence, Owen. You went to the bank on my behalf before you had any reason to believe I'd be anything other than rude to you about it. You sat with Pete Garza through 2 nights of fever so his wife could rest. You wrote a letter to the most dangerous man in this county on my behalf and never said a word about it to me because you didn't want to raise my hopes. And you braided my daughter's hair on a cold morning when she was alone and crying, without being asked and without making a moment of it." She looked at him. She said, "Owen Wells, I have been in love with you since February and I have been very stubborn about it, and I am done being stubborn. Yes, I will have you." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she now recognized as the one that meant he felt something too large to speak and was working out how to carry it. Then he said, "I'll go see Reverend Aldred in the morning," she said. "Marigold will be insufferably pleased with herself." He said, "She'll have earned it." Charlotte laughed. Marigold stirred in her sleep. Outside, the New Mexico territory turned in the June dark, wide and ancient and indifferent to small human happiness, which made the small human happiness feel all the more valuable for being held against such vast indifference. The territorial court ruled in Charlotte's favor in July. It was not a total or simple victory. The law in 1882 was a negotiated thing, shaped by money and influence as much as by justice, and Selah's Croft was not ruined by the ruling. But the ruling was clear. The pattern of harassment was documented. The bank interference was found to be in violation of land grant protections, and 3 of the 4 claims Croft had targeted were affirmed. The Ray's family, who had already been pushed off their land, received a small compensation that was insufficient but was something. Gerald Pierce at the bank was required to restructure Charlotte's loan under legitimate terms. 2 of Croft's writers faced separate charges in territorial court, and the Croft Company's expansion in the Dustcreek area was effectively blocked for the foreseeable future. Selah's Croft himself moved on to other territory, other acquisitions, other battles. Men like Croft always moved on. It was the nature of the injustice that it did not end but only shifted, and Charlotte and Reverend Aldred and Elijah Moore and Hector Vega all knew this. But the Keller claim was secure, and the other homesteaders still holding had been given breathing room, and that was the victory available, and they took it. Charlotte stood on her porch on the evening after the ruling came through and looked at her land in the late summer light, the kitchen garden and the small pasture, and the fence line that had been cut so many times she had lost count, and she breathed. Owen came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and they stood there for a while in the way of 2 people who have come through something difficult together, and are taking a moment to understand that they are both still standing. She said, "Thank you," he said. "You did most of it," she said. "We did it." He bent his head and put his lips against her hair. They were married on the last Saturday of August 1882 in the church schoolhouse that Reverend Aldred ran, with the whole population of Dustcreek in attendance and Marigold Keller in a white dress that Rosaria Vega had stayed up 3 nights sewing, and an expression of profound vindicated satisfaction on her 6-year-old face. Owen wore a dark coat that Elijah Moore had helped him press, and his boots were clean, and his face, when Charlotte came through the door on Reverend Aldred's arm, did something complicated and unguarded that several of the women in the pews noted privately as the most convincing evidence they had seen, yet that the man was deeply and genuinely in love. Charlotte wore a blue dress the color of the pre-storm sky that Marigold had once described as her favorite color, and she walked toward Owen Wells with the specific courage of someone who has chosen to love again after loss, which is a different and perhaps larger courage than loving for the first time. The ceremony was the traditional words. The vows were the traditional vows, except that when Owen said to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, he said it looking directly at Charlotte with the complete absence of any performance that was his particular signature, and the room was very quiet. When Reverend Aldred said they could be husband and wife, Marigold said, "Finally," in a voice that was not as quiet as she intended, and the whole church laughed. Owen picked Marigold up and held her between them while he kissed Charlotte, and it was not a very dignified wedding kiss. 3 people tangled together with a child trying to see what was happening, but it was more honest than a dignified one would have been. The town threw a supper that evening in the churchyard, with tables set outside and lanterns strung between the cottonwood trees and fiddle music from old Alejandro Garza, Pete's brother, who played with the specific joy of a man who does not get enough opportunity to play at events this happy. Charlotte and Owen danced badly and cheerfully, and Marigold danced with everyone, and Elijah Moore made a toast that was simple and direct, and made Owen look at his boots for a moment in the way he did when something touched him deeply. Elijah said, "To Owen Wells, who came to Dustcreek looking for a reason to be a better man and found one. And to Charlotte Keller Wells, who did not make it easy for him, which is the best thing she could have done, because a man who earns what he's given understands its value, and to Marigold, who knew the whole time. More laughter, more dancing. The summer night stretched warm and starlit over the territory, and Charlotte leaned against her husband's shoulder and thought that she was, improbably and gratefully, happy. The early months of marriage were a revelation to both of them in the particular way of two adults who have lived independently for long enough to have developed strong preferences and occasional difficult habits, and must now negotiate the intimate territory of a shared life. Charlotte was meticulous about her accounts and her records, and found Owen's casual relationship with documentation initially maddening, because a man who had lived on the move for 15 years did not naturally think about keeping receipts. Owen, for his part, was accustomed to making decisions alone and found the process of consulting another person before acting on those decisions genuinely challenging, even when he understood and agreed with the necessity. They argued twice in September, both times about nothing that was actually the thing they were arguing about. Both times the argument ended with one of them saying something honest about what was underneath the surface argument, which required courage and was therefore difficult. But both times the honesty resolved it, and both times the resolution was closer than they had been before, which Charlotte began to understand was the actual mechanism of intimacy, not the absence of conflict, but the practice of finding each other on the other side of it. Marigold watched these negotiations with deep interest and occasionally offered opinions that were startlingly accurate for a 6-year-old, which Charlotte and Owen tried not to laugh about in front of her. Owen formally adopted Marigold in the fall. The legal process in the territory was not complicated, and Reverend Aldred helped with the paperwork. When it was done, Marigold Keller became Marigold Wells, and she announced this to everyone in Dustcreek who had not yet heard, which was approximately no one, since the town had been following the proceedings with benevolent interest. She also informed her teacher, who was Reverend Aldred's wife Edith, that she would need to update the school register, and she watched this happen with the expression of someone completing a long project. Owen found out about this last part from Edith Aldred, and he was quiet for a long moment when he heard it, and then he went and found Marigold where she was feeding the chickens and crouched down to her level and said, "I heard you updated the school register." Marigold said with the guileless directness of a child, "Of course I did. You're my papa now." Owen said, in a voice he kept very level, "Yes, I am." He helped her finish feeding the chickens. Charlotte watched from the kitchen window and let herself feel the weight and the warmth of it. The way this thing she had been so afraid of was actually solid ground. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold and harsh as winters in the New Mexico territory could be, but the farmhouse was repaired and properly insulated now, and they had enough wood laid in and enough stores in the cellar, and Charlotte was pregnant by December. A fact she told Owen on a Tuesday morning over coffee with a directness that was entirely consistent with her character, and that still clearly shook him loose from all his customary composure. He put down his cup. He looked at her, he said, are you well? Do you need?" and then stopped because he clearly could not decide which question was most important. She said, "I'm well, I'm happy. I'm also slightly terrified, which I imagine is normal." He came around the table and held her in the careful way of a man holding something precious, and she felt his hands in her hair the same way she had watched them in Marigold's hair that April morning, and she thought that the man's gentleness was the most hidden and most real thing about him, more real than the reputation, more real than the gun and the past and the years of difficult living. She said against his shoulder, "Say something." He said, "I'm going to be a better man for this than I've been for anything." She said, "You're already a good man, Owen." He did not argue with her. He was learning to accept when she said something true. Marigold took the news of the coming baby with characteristic pragmatism. She said, "I want a brother." When asked why, she said, "Because I want someone to be in charge of." Charlotte and Owen looked at each other. Charlotte said, "We'll see." As it turned out, Marigold got her wish. Their son was born in August of 1883. A healthy, loud, astonishingly hungry boy they named James Daniel Wells. James for Owen's brother and Daniel for Charlotte's first husband, because both men deserved to be remembered, and because the child who carried the names could grow up knowing the full history of the family he came from. Dustcreek received the news of the birth with genuine celebration. Elijah Moore brought a cradle he had built. Rosaria Vega arrived with enough food to feed a small army and stayed for a week, which was invaluable because Charlotte had a harder recovery than she had hoped for, and Owen, despite being thoroughly competent at almost everything else in his life, had never managed an infant before and found the first 2 weeks a humbling experience. Marigold was an excellent helper. She said so herself frequently. Owen sat with the baby on his chest in the evenings while Charlotte slept, and the baby's small weight against his heartbeat was something he could not have predicted and could not adequately describe. This person who was small enough to hold in one hand and was somehow the most consequential thing that had ever been in that hand. He thought about his brother James a great deal in those evenings. He thought about the ranch in Texas and the mistakes he had made, and the years in between and the long road to this particular porch in this particular territory. And he thought that the road had been as crooked and as costly as roads tended to be, and that he had arrived somewhere worth arriving. In the spring of 1884, the Croft Company came up in conversation again, not as an active threat, but as a concluded chapter. Marcus Webb wrote from Santa Fe to inform them that Silas Croft had sold his New Mexico Territory interests and moved operations to Colorado. The syndicate's remaining local holdings were being sold off piecemeal. The homesteaders who had survived the pressure were secure. The letter arrived on a Thursday, and Charlotte read it at the kitchen table and then put it down and sat with it for a moment. Owen was outside with James on his back in a carrier Rosaria had made, doing some work on the pasture fence, and Marigold was at school. Charlotte sat alone with the letter and the quiet house and the sound of the wind in the cottonwood trees that she had first heard on the day she arrived in Dustcreek with a dead husband's deed and a baby on her hip and no certainty of anything at all. She thought about everything that had happened between that day and this one. She thought about how little she had expected any of it. She took the letter outside to show Owen. He read it standing at the fence with James making exploratory sounds on his back, and when he finished he looked up at Charlotte and gave her the rare, full smile that she had been collecting like a woman collecting something valuable. He said, "It's over." She said, "It's over." He said, "What do you want to do with that?" She thought about it. She said, "I want to plant more fruit trees this fall. I've been wanting an orchard. And I want to talk to Hector Vega about expanding the cattle arrangement. And she stopped. She said, "I want to stay here a long time. I want to be old here. With you." Owen looked at her with that open, unguarded expression that had cost him nothing to feel and everything to learn to show. He said, "That's exactly what I want." James chose this moment to make an emphatic noise and grab his father's ear, which broke the moment in the best possible way, and Charlotte laughed and took the baby so Owen could rub his ear, and the morning went on around them in its ordinary, irreplaceable way. The years settled into a good life in the way that good lives do, not without difficulty, but with the specific resilience of things rooted deeply enough to bend without breaking. The orchard Charlotte planted in the fall of 1884 was small, but growing. The cattle arrangement with Hector Vega expanded and turned into a genuine partnership. Owen worked the land and continued, quietly and without announcing it, to be the person Dustcreek's residents came to when things needed someone steady and reliable, though he wore no badge and had no official standing, because sometimes a town needs a person in the spaces between the formal structures, and Owen occupied that space naturally. He had put the gun away. Not dramatically, not in any announcement. He had simply placed it in the chest at the foot of the bed one evening and had not taken it out again in a functional sense. He was not naive. He knew the territory and he was not unprepared. But the gun was not a daily presence anymore, and the absence of it felt like something healed. In the spring of 1885, Charlotte told him she was pregnant again. This time he was calmer about it, though his eyes went warm in the particular way she associated with him being moved past the usual barriers of his composure. He said, "How are you feeling?" She said, "Strong. Better than last time." He said, "Good. We'll be all right." They were. Their second child, a girl they named Rose Aldred Wells after Reverend Aldred, in a gesture that made the Reverend clear his throat several times when they told him, was born in October of 1885. She came into the world with the same volume as her brother and the same determined look on her small face that Charlotte had. And Owen stood in the room looking at this second improbable gift, and felt the specific gratitude of a man who has been given more than he knew to ask for. Marigold, 10 years old now and seriously invested in the domestic life of the Wells farm, declared that Rose was perfect and immediately began teaching her things. Rose was far too small to understand, but accepted with placid tolerance. James, 2 years old and in possession of strong opinions about almost everything, looked at his new sister with a suspicious expression that gradually, over the next several weeks, converted to proprietary affection. Owen watched his children with the attentiveness of a man who had spent 15 years paying attention to things that could kill him, now entirely redirected to things that sustained him. He paid attention to what Marigold read and what she was thinking about and who her friends were at school. He paid attention to when James was getting sick before James knew it himself, and to what particular sound Rose's crying meant, which turned out to be a language with specific vocabulary. He paid attention to Charlotte in the way of a man who finds his wife perpetually interesting, which Charlotte found both gratifying and occasionally amusing, because she was not a woman who thought of herself as fascinating, and his consistent regard sometimes made her laugh. She had her own attentions. She paid attention to when Owen was carrying something heavy from his past, the days when he was quieter than usual, and whatever he was carrying was visible in the set of his shoulders. She had learned not to press immediately but to make room, to be near him without requiring anything, in the way he had first made room for her. She had learned this from watching him do it, which was one of the particular economies of a good marriage, the way the lessons circulate between two people until it is impossible to remember who gave what first. Dustcreek changed around them over those years. The territory was moving toward statehood, which would not come until 1912 for New Mexico. But the momentum was building, and the changes it brought were visible every year in the form of new families, new roads, new disputes, and new negotiations between the old inhabitants and the new ones. Elijah Moore's smithy grew into a full livery business. Hector and Rosaria Vega built a proper ranch house, and their children played with the Wells children in the wide yards between properties. Reverend Aldred retired from the schoolhouse teaching work, and a young woman from Ohio named Miss Clara Reed took over the school with formidable efficiency. In 1887, Marigold was 12 and already serious about books in the way that suggested she would leave Dustcreek eventually for somewhere she could study, which Charlotte thought about with the mixed pride and preemptive grief of a mother who wants her child's fullest possible life, even when it means that life takes the child away. Owen, when Charlotte told him she was thinking about this, said that when the time came they would make sure Marigold had what she needed to go, and that they would also make sure she knew that coming back was always possible. He said this with the specific clarity of a man who understood the value of having somewhere to come back to, because he had spent 15 years without one. One evening in the summer of 1887, Owen and Charlotte sat on the porch after the children were in bed, in the warm dark with the cattle sounds from the pasture and the star-thick sky, and Charlotte said, "Do you remember the first morning, when I found you braiding Marigold's hair?" Owen said, "I remember." Charlotte said, "You didn't say anything. Not about what you'd done, not about it being kind, not anything. You just did it." He said, "It wasn't a thing that needed saying." She looked at him. She said, "I fell in love with you in that moment. I mean, I was already in love with you, I just hadn't admitted it. But in that moment I understood that whatever you'd been before, you were this. You were this person who put his hands into a child's hair and did a careful, patient job of it without needing credit. I thought, if a man can do that, he's a man I trust." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was terrified you'd ask me to leave after you found the letter." She said, "I know." "I could see it," he said. "I didn't know how to explain it without it sounding—" "I know," Charlotte said, "but you didn't need to. I read it and I understood." He reached over and took her hand. She said, "I'm so glad you knocked on my door that first time." He said, "I repaired your fence first." She said, "I know, and then you knocked." He said, "I was going to just leave, but I thought you deserved to know who had done it." She said, "I'm glad you thought that." They sat in the dark holding hands while the territory breathed around them and their children slept in the house behind them, and the cottonwood trees made their soft sound in the night wind. And it was one of those ordinary moments that are secretly the most significant ones, the kind that do not announce themselves, but that both people know, years later, to have been the center of something. Marigold did leave Dustcreek, eventually. In 1893, when she was 17, she went to Albuquerque to continue her schooling at a newly established school for young women, and Charlotte packed her trunk with the careful attention of a woman who is trying to give everything necessary without being able to give enough. Owen drove her to the stage in Roswell and walked her to the door of the stage and held her face in those big, gentle hands and said, "You come back when you need to. And you write." Marigold, who was 17 and had her mother's eyes and her own specific determination, said, "I'll write every week." She kept her word. James grew up with his father's quietness and his mother's precision, and by the time he was 12, he was the most capable hand on the Keller Wells property and knew it without being insufferable about it, which was the best possible combination. Rose grew up reading everything she could find and arguing all of it, which Miss Clara Reed called challenging and which Charlotte and Owen called exactly right. In the fall of 1892, Charlotte and Owen sat on their porch, which had been extended twice over the years as the needs of the family changed, and watched the last of the September light go gold across the pasture, and Charlotte said, "I want to tell you something." Owen said, "All right." She said, "I spent a long time being afraid that loving you would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. I thought love was a thing that took more than it gave because I had lost someone I loved and the cost of that was so large I didn't think I could pay it again. And I want you to know that I was wrong. Not about the cost love does cost, but the thing I couldn't see before is that what you get back is larger than what it takes." Owen was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the pasture. He said, "You told me I was already a good man when I didn't believe it." She said, "Because you were." He said, "I'm better because of you, not because of what you gave me or did for me. Because you required me to be honest and to stay and to keep getting up. That's what you gave me." She said, "We did it for each other." He looked at her, and it was the same look he had given her on the church schoolhouse steps the morning he arrived and 3 seconds later looked away, except that it did not look away now, because he did not need to not want her anymore. He could just want her, fully and without apology, which was the thing he had been working toward for a long time. He said, "I love you, Charlotte." She said, "I love you, Owen. I have loved you since at least February of 1882, and I intend to continue." He laughed that good, rough, genuine laugh, and she leaned against him, and the porch held them in the September dark while Dustcreek went about its evening business around them. In 1895, Marigold came home for the summer and brought a young man named Francisco Ruiz whom she had met through the school in Albuquerque, and who was a schoolteacher himself, serious and kind, and clearly devoted to Marigold in a way that required no decoding. Charlotte liked him immediately. Owen talked to him seriously and at length about Marigold and about his intentions, which Francisco bore with patient respect, and afterward Owen told Charlotte that he thought the young man was good enough, which in Owen's language meant he approved entirely. Marigold and Francisco were engaged by August and married the following spring in Dustcreek's church, which by then had been rebuilt into a proper stone building, and the ceremony was the kind of full, complicated, beautiful celebration that a town puts on for the people it has watched grow up. And Charlotte held Owen's hand through the whole of it and only cried once, which she felt was a reasonable performance. James turned 14 in 1897 and announced his intention to expand the cattle operation substantially, with specific plans that he presented to his parents as a formal proposal, because that was the kind of boy he was. Owen listened to the whole thing with serious attention, and then said that the plan was good and they would work on it together. And James's contained satisfaction at this response was identical to Charlotte's expression in certain moments, which Owen found privately delightful. Rose turned 12 in 1897 and was already arguing legal questions with anyone willing to engage her, because she had read about the territory's path toward statehood in the newspaper and had opinions. Reverend Aldred, long retired from preaching but still enormously present in Dustcreek's civic life, called Rose a future force, and no one disagreed. The Wells family's Christmas in 1897 was large and warm and chaotic. Marigold and Francisco home from Albuquerque with their 8-month-old son, the first grandchild, a boy they named Owen Thomas Ruiz after his grandfather and Reverend Aldred. James home from a cattle buying trip to Roswell with new ideas and a sunburn. Rose deep in a debate about New Mexico's territorial politics with anyone who would hold still long enough. And Charlotte and Owen at the center of it all, in the farmhouse that had been expanded and repaired and improved across 15 years, until it was large enough to hold the family that kept growing from it. On Christmas Eve, after the children and grandchild were settled, Charlotte and Owen stood in the kitchen together in the quiet that came after, and Charlotte was washing the supper things and Owen was drying them, which was the specific domestic intimacy that Charlotte had once thought she would never have again after Daniel died. She said, "I'm happy, Owen." He put down the dish he was drying. He turned to look at her. He said, "So am I," she said, fully, completely, not the scared version. He said, "Not the scared version." She said, "That's rare." He said, "I know." He put the dish down and came around the table and held her the way he had held her the morning she told him she was pregnant the first time, careful and certain and entirely present. And she leaned into him with the complete, unguarded trust of 15 years of marriage. 15 years of arguments and resolutions and honest conversations in the dark and children born and children grown and cattle seasons and legal battles and Christmas dinners and ordinary Tuesdays that accumulated into a life. She said into his shoulder, "A long time ago you told Marigold that steadfast meant you hold on even when it's hard." He said, "I remember." She said, "You held on." He said, "So did you." She said, "We held on." He said, "Yes, we did." Outside, Dustcreek lay quiet under a clear, cold December sky, the territorial stars as numerous and indifferent as they had always been, the cottonwood trees bare now and rattling lightly in the wind, the pasture still and the cattle settled, and the small lights of the town's windows scattered across the dark like an answer to the stars. The land that Charlotte Keller had been told to sell, and had refused to sell, stretched in every direction from the farmhouse, fenced and worked and producing, 160 acres that had been a dead man's dream and had become a living family's home. And inside that home on Christmas Eve, Owen Wells held his wife in the kitchen, and the house breathed around them with the warmth of sleeping grandchildren and grown children, and a life built from nothing and from everything. And the man who had come to Dustcreek to find a reason to be better had found it, kept it, built it into something that would outlast him, and would not have traded any of it for the world. In the morning, Marigold would come downstairs with the baby on her hip and James would already be at the fence checking on something, and Rose would be reading at the kitchen table before anyone else was properly awake. and Owen would make coffee and Charlotte would make biscuits, and the family would settle into Christmas Day in the particular, irreplaceable way of families that have chosen each other, and kept choosing each other across years and difficulty and change. That morning would come. But first there was this. A man and a woman in a warm kitchen holding on, the way they always had, steadfast, which meant you hold on even when it's hard, and even more, even better, when it is not hard at all, when the holding on is the easiest and most essential thing in the world, which is what it felt like on that Christmas Eve in Dustcreek, New Mexico Territory, 1897, in the farmhouse built on 160 acres of land that nobody was ever going to take. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees, the stars turned, the territory held its vast, ancient silence. Inside, everything that mattered was warm.